Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak, your podcast available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Thursday the 15th of August here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, US inflation data drives Fed bets as one policymaker tells us he's growing more concerned about employment.
The World Health Organization declares a deadly Mpox outbreak in Africa a global health emergency.
Plus, E. coli and dead fish. Bloomberg finds evidence that sewage flowing into Europe's rivers is making people sick and killing wildlife.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The Federal Reserve's Austan Goolsbee says he's growing more concerned about the labour market than inflation. The Bank of Chicago Fed president has also told Bloomberg that current interest rates are very restrictive. His comments follow data released yesterday showing a key measure of underlying US inflation eased for a fourth straight month. David Kelly, chief global strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management, says the numbers are heading in the right direction.
I think it's pretty good news in the actual transactions markets of the economy where people are sort of bidding and asking for in terms of prices. Inflation's disappearing. So I think that overall this very much confirms the idea that inflation is heading down.
JP Morgan's David Kelly speaking there. The Fed is widely expected to lower interest rates in September, though investors and economists are split on whether that will be by a quarter point or a half point reduction.
The World Health Organization has declared an outbreak of Mpox in Africa a global health emergency. The call comes after a mutated strain of the virus, which causes painful lesions, spread to at least 6 African countries, infecting about 15,000 people. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, says that the organization is working hard to tackle the outbreak.
We're on the ground supporting case investigation and contact tracing. We're training health workers. We're supporting countries to access vaccines and develop the strategies to roll them out.
Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus speaking there. More than 500 people have lost their lives to the disease in the Democratic Republic of Congo alone. Officials and advisors are now drafting guidance for affected countries.
Iran has still not carried out the retaliation it promised 2 weeks ago for the killing of a senior Hamas leader in Tehran, leading to Western fears about what escalation may come. Officials have been saying an attack could come at any time. Evelyn Farkas is a US national security expert who's worked at the Pentagon.
Every day that we have the Iranians poised to make an attack is a day where the risk of real escalation and all-out war, a full, multiple front war in Israel increases. So we're at a very dangerous moment in time, and negotiations, as you know, appear stalled.
Executive Director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University, Evelyn Farkas, speaking there. US and EU officials have been trying to encourage Israel and Hamas to attend ceasefire talks on the calendar for later today. Both Iran and the US have said a ceasefire in Gaza would have a ripple effect of calming wider tensions in the region.
Now, in other news, the SEC has fined 26 financial firms a total of $393 million as part of its WhatsApp probe. The US regulator says the companies failed to keep employees' electronic communications and broke federal securities law. The fines add to billions already paid by big banks.
Apple is moving forward with its shift into robotics, with hundreds of staff working on a new product designed to rival the Amazon Echo. The project is aiming to create an iPad device attached to a robotic arm that can follow you around the home and act as a smart home command centre. Bloomberg's tech correspondent Mark Gurman broke the story. He says it's a sign of where the tech giant thinks the future is.
They're all in on robotics right now. Robotics is the next big thing at Apple. They're talking about humanoids. They're talking about mobile robots to go around your home.
Gurman also notes the move is part of a broader effort to boost sales. Apple still gets roughly half its revenue from the iPhone, which has sold sluggishly in recent quarters.
Citigroup has become the latest major bank to lift a pre-Brexit cap on bonuses in a boost for London bankers. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the story.
It's the latest bank to do away with the limit on performance-related pay for some employees. Citigroup is following in the footsteps of rival lenders, opening the door for its material risk takers to earn up to 6 times their base salary in additional compensation. The news, released in an internal memo seen by Bloomberg, places the firm just behind Wall Street peers JP Morgan and Barclays, where as much as 10 times base salary is up for grabs. Citigroup's latest move comes nearly a year after the UK lifted EU-era salary restrictions as part of a broader push to make post-Brexit Britain more attractive. Investment bankers, traders and even compliance personnel will be eligible for enlarged rewards. A spokeswoman said the adjustments will allow the company to remain, quote, highly attractive to talent. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, in a moment, we'll bring you more on the path ahead for the Federal Reserve, plus look at the problems that sewage spills are causing in the water supplies of Europe. That in a moment. But before that, this other story caught my eye. I mean, perhaps it's trivial, but priciest homes in London are not selling and apparently are piling up. I like this data. It's from Lonres. It shows that deals for homes of £5 million or more have actually plunged. In July, they were down 19%. I think it's just quite interesting, that London has been obviously so expensive on this super sort of prime segment of the market. We've actually seen quite a significant hit. That's not, well, in some senses it's because sterling has weakened. In some senses, it's also because the peak of the market is gone. But there's also a real worry, and this is a bit kind of political. It's about the changes to taxation, how richer people are going to be taxed, the idea of getting rid of non-doms, which is the sort of stated aim of the government, of the Labour government after they won the election. So, I just thought the data is really quite interesting.
Especially when we think about in the wider London prime market, sales were up by about 9% last month from a year earlier. So there was some sort of a post-election bounce in sentiment as well, and the number of properties going under offer also increasing in July too. So despite the uptick in sales, there's still concerns about that end of the market.
So that's one of the stories that we're watching for you this morning on the Bloomberg Terminal. Now, let's also get into the detail after yesterday's US inflation data, which showed core CPI easing for a 4th month in a row. Let's think about the rate path ahead then for the Federal Reserve. Of course, we have more data coming today on retail sales and jobless claims. Bloomberg opinion columnist Daniel Moss joins us now for more. Good morning, Daniel. You've been writing recently about how this is the yes, but easing cycle. When you read what Austan Goolsbee told Bloomberg about where interest rates are now, can there be any hesitation about the Fed actually cutting in September?
As things stand, I don't think there's any doubt about that. That column was as much about how central banks are framing this moment as anything else. We had a great example of that from New Zealand yesterday. The central bank governor insisted the interest rate cut he enacted minutes earlier was not an easing. No, we're not. No, we're still restrictive, just slightly less restrictive. And this is not an embrace of dovishness. This is because of the ghost of transitory and similar terms that other monetary authorities use, because that was such a jarring once in 40 years experience. They're kind of haunted by that. So they want to emphasize that this is not a full-blooded 2008 style easing. This is not a 2020 style easing. This is kind of going to be a bit of a midterm adjustment. We won't let down our guard. We're still inflation targeters. Inflation hurts everybody. The best way we can secure the job market is to defeat inflation. Now, Jay Powell's been, giving a little bit more lip service to the employment side of the Fed's mandate. But, this is not going to be we're all out to prop up growth. This is going to be we are in a position to be less tight than we were. Not easy.
Is that not central bankers just being sensible, though, to avoid the risk of, in case inflation flares up again and they have to roll back on cuts they've already made? Is this them being too worried about the markets?
Well, I think it's the ghost of transitory. And while that word became a sort of singular rallying cry for policy mistakes in 2021, I would emphasise other central banks used very similar terms, and they've been struggling for a couple of years to live that down. So you're not going to see them embrace dovishness, okay? They'll talk about how they're confident that inflation is retreating, vigilance is required, It's like the actions have to be sort of shrouded in not quite subterfuge, but, there'll be some hair splitting in the language.
Interesting. Also, though, what's going on in China? It's so very different to what's happening in the US. The figures out this morning showing China weakness in terms of investment, in terms of consumption. Deflation is a much bigger concern there than inflation is. And you've been writing about why Beijing should consider an inflation target. Why?
So China these days gets no shortage of economic and financial advice. Some of it very well-meaning, some of it clearly aimed at curtailing or containing, what China sees as its, rightful rise in the world. What was interesting about commentary from an academic was it came from inside the tent. This is an influential advisor to the People's Bank of China saying, hey, why don't we adopt a hard inflation target? Well, just like everybody else. And why not put a 2 in front of it? Look, this is something that has a lot of merit. You can say, well, why would China be worried about inflation? If anything, it should be worried about deflation. The thing we learned in the decade before COVID was it works both ways. Remember Janet Yellen declaring at a press conference the absence of inflation was the great mystery of our time. Okay, so policy can stay easy and be aggressively easy if you want to lift up to 2%. Now, China is such a long way from 2%. People were popping champagne when CPI, increased 0.5% from a year earlier. Never mind 5. Never mind 1.5. So they've got a real problem there. And this idea has found itself in the mix. Now, it's not without its challenges. Inflation targeting central banks are generally considered to be relatively independent of other parts of government. And in China, an independent anything can be, shall we say, problematic. But you can adopt the substance of an inflation target without necessarily the full-bore independence. The election of the Starmer government had a lot of people recalling the very, very early days of the Blair government when, within days of Labor being elected in 1997, Gordon Brown gave the Bank of England full monetary independence. It had an inflation target 5 years earlier. So things tend to go hand in hand, but don't have to. China doesn't seem to have many ideas right now on the monetary front. This is one.
Okay. Daniel Moss, Bloomberg opinion columnist, thank you very much. Now, in Paris, there was an unwelcome sideshow to the Olympics, the city's sewage problem, which threatened plans to hold swimming events in the Seine, which did eventually go ahead with some delays. In the UK, water companies have faced scrutiny over untreated sewage finding its way into rivers. But the problem isn't confined to France and Britain. There are countries across Europe facing the same issues. Bloomberg Green reporter Olivia Rudgard has been writing about this, and she joins us now. Morning to you, Olivia. Why is untreated sewage ending up in rivers in Europe?
Well, the primary reason for this, the specific untreated sewage problem, is that a lot of these systems are quite old. So essentially, there are two ways you can build a sewer system. You can build it so that your rainwater and your foul water or your sewage go into separate pipes, or you can build it so they all go into one pipe. And a lot of older systems were built so that they all go into one pipe. And what that means is that when it rains, the pipe gets filled up, the system can't cope, and you have these escape valves, release valves, that then put the mixture of water into rivers and the sea, it's supposed to work that way to stop the water sort of backing up into people's homes, onto the streets. But obviously it's not an ideal situation, because you then end up with all of the nasty stuff from people's homes and businesses polluting rivers and the sea. And what we've seen in the UK is that actually these systems are spilling not only on those days when it's raining really, really heavily, but much more frequently than that.
Yeah, and so the effects of all of this sewage on people and wildlife.
Yeah, exactly. So, what you find, some of the nasty stuff you find in sewage, you find, very high levels of nutrients, things like phosphorus and nitrogen. And what that causes is, build-up of things like algae in rivers and sort of other waterways, which chokes out everything else. So all the kind of nice, native sort of pondweed and things like that you might get that provides a habitat and food for wildlife, can't survive anymore. And then you also get bacteria. So you get things like E. coli, which obviously is what makes the headlines quite frequently when people get sick. They accidentally swallow some water, some gets into their body in some kind of way. Sorry, it's not very nice at this time in the morning.
I know.
And that obviously is not brilliant for people who are sort of trying to enjoy the waterways, use them for recreation and fun.
So what could be done to stop these spills then?
So, the ultimate kind of silver bullet solution is obviously to separate them out. And we talked to people for this story who said if you were starting from scratch now and a lot of newer systems, you would separate them out. But unfortunately, that's extremely disruptive and expensive. It would cost probably in this country, where the estimate has been done, hundreds of billions of pounds was the estimate. So it's really, really, really expensive. There are things that you can do to reduce the amount of water that actually ends up in the sewers. And really the way that you do that is by slowing the flow. So, instead of paving over everything, creating more kind of rain gardens, creating more soakaways. What they've done in Paris to try and reduce their problem was to essentially create sort of basins to store the water, to stop it flowing down into the system quite so quickly. So you can kind of create a system where you have valves that stops everything sort of going down right to the bottom straight away. So there, depending on your budget and how much disruption you want to cause, there are a few different options.
Yeah, budget is quite an important one, though, isn't it? I suppose, why hasn't this been addressed or fixed before? Is it climate change? I know everyone's wild swimming now, but surely people knew about this quite some time ago.
Yeah, I think, I've thought about this a lot in the UK, because the water companies for sure knew that, this was how the systems work, but I think it came as quite a shock to the general public. I think it's one of those things where there have been so many other issues with rivers, especially if you think about European rivers, they're also polluted by agriculture, by industry, there's mining, there's a lot of other things going on, that it really hasn't kind of risen to the forefront before now. But what's actually happened is regulation, has tightened up on all those other sources of pollution. And now, we're really getting to the stage where the combined sewer overflows are taking up a much greater proportion of the problem. And I think the other thing, as you say, is that people are increasingly, looking to use the waterways for recreation. I think this is something that happened a lot during COVID, wild swimming in the UK. And, I talked to some really interesting campaigners in Belgium who were sort of trying to do the same thing, trying to get people to engage with, say, the canals in Brussels or in Ghent as something that's a resource. It's something nice that you can use, for fun, which is really not possible right now, especially for swimming, because they're just not clean enough.
Is this just a European problem, or has it been experienced in other parts of the world as well?
So it's not unique to Europe. There are combined systems, especially on the sort of east coast of America. The older systems that were built sort of a little bit longer ago tended to be combined. There are some combined systems in China and Australia as well. I think the thing about Europe is that because, some of the first sewer systems in the world were in the UK, and that's where it sort of spread from, we have a really, really high proportion of them. So it's about 70%, I think, that are combined, which is, that much higher than other parts of the world. But I think there probably are other rivers that are being polluted in this way, and it's just not really talked about or known about. So, I wouldn't say it's unique to Europe, but, I think it's going to sort of raise up the agenda everywhere in the world. Yeah,
and there's also, I was speaking to, a few months back, one of the Conservative members of the Environment Committee here in the UK on this very issue. And what I was struck by is that they were putting it into a much longer perspective, saying that actually the regulation has tightened up and rivers are much cleaner than they've ever been before. They were going back to the 1950s as a comparison. So there is another view that actually rivers have become much less polluted than they were in the past. And I suppose that brings me to the question about whether regulators or the EU are doing something about this now. What can they do about it now?
Yeah, I think that's, that is right to some extent. Like, it's certainly things like chemical pollution, like I said before, that has been cleared up a lot, which is why I think we're now getting to this stage where this is the sort of final thing that hasn't been addressed. So, the reason I think this is really coming to a head for European countries, there's a couple of bits of EU legislation that are sort of either being updated or sort of coming down the track. The rules that govern how urban areas must treat their sewage, they've been tightened up this year. They've just agreed new rules that sort of make it so that you have to monitor and sort of keep an eye on more of your sewer overflows. And then there's another deadline coming down in 2027 for the overall status of water bodies. And the last check-in we had on that was 2021, which showed that pretty much everyone was way off track for meeting that.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.